Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the case of Gemma Mccluskie. This case is probably one of my most requested cases ever since I started doing these videos. I've seen this case request come up multiple times in like comments and on my case request form, so I'm doing it today. And some of you who also live in Britain may actually recognise this woman's name, Gemma Mccluskie, and that is because she was on a really popular British soap opera that we have here in Britain called EastEnders. Like I said, it's a really big popular show that we have here. I've been watching it for years, my family have been watching it for years, so some of you may actually recognise this woman or have heard of her name before because she played a character called Kerry Skinner on EastEnders in 2001, and we'll talk a little bit more about her time in EastEnders and her career and her life as we get on into the video, obviously. But before we do, I just want to say I found this case particularly hard to research because I found it really difficult to kind of piece this case together. There wasn't too many sources, or reliable sources anyway, online that gave a good kind of overview of the timeline of events, if that makes sense. So I really apologise if I've gotten something wrong. I've tried my hardest, like I said, so I'm pretty sure that all this information is correct, but as I normally say, I do apologise if it isn't, and feel free to let me know. I just want to clarify before I get into the case that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved in the case, and like I just said, if I've gotten something wrong or I've missed something out, then feel free to let me know in the comments. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. So this is Gemma Mccluskie. She was a 29-year-old woman born on the 5th of February 1983, and she was from Shoreditch in East London. Her parents were Anthony and Pauline Mccluskie, and Gemma also had two older brothers named Danny and Tony. Now, Danny was the oldest of the three siblings. I believe he was around 7 or 8 years older than Gemma, and Gemma's other older brother, Tony, was 6 years older than her, I believe. And from what I could gather online, Gemma and her brothers had a pretty normal, average, happy upbringing and childhood. However, their parents, Anthony and Pauline, did actually end up getting a divorce when the siblings were all still quite young. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't really any particular reason why Anthony and Pauline got a divorce. It was just because they weren't getting along as well as they used to, and so they just thought it was for the best that they separated. However, their divorce did have a bit of an impact on Gemma and her brothers, as it does for most children when their parents split up. But despite this, Gemma still had a good upbringing, and she was described as a very happy, friendly and kind person. She had a lot of friends. She was a very popular person. And Gemma's oldest brother, Danny, was quite similar in those aspects. He was quite confident, he was boisterous, whereas their other sibling, Tony, wasn't really like that. He was kind of the opposite. Tony was a lot more quiet and reserved, and he used to get really badly bullied in school to the point where his parents, Anthony and Pauline, actually had to take him out of school. But despite that, everyone said that Tony was actually a really nice person and he would pretty much do anything for anyone. However, Tony actually started taking and experimenting with drugs in his teenage years. He would often smoke weed and skunk and sometimes even cocaine, and this drug habit continued into adulthood. But he did work. He did a lot of different kind of manual jobs, and he just kind of went from one job to another a lot. One minute he would be doing like bricklaying, the next he would be doing window cleaning, so he went from job to job a lot, and I don't actually know why. I couldn't really find a reason for this. I don't know whether it was just him being incapable of being able to hold down one job. I don't know if he was fired from all these jobs and so that's why he had to go from one to another, or was it just something to do with the job? I don't know. I couldn't find a reason for that, but yeah. But back to Gemma. So from a really young age, Gemma's family said that she was always obsessed with acting and she always wanted to grow up and be an actress. She just pretty much loved the whole kind of musical theatre scene. She loved singing, she loved dancing, but her passion was acting and her main kind of goal in life was to be an actress. She just loved the spotlight. She loved being the centre of attention, and when Gemma was just 7 years old, she actually earned a place at a drama school, and she would go on to be featured in a children's TV programme, a period drama, and a few TV adverts here and there. And then when Gemma was just 17 years old, she landed a role in EastEnders where she played a character called Kerry Skinner. There are actually some clips online of Gemma playing Kerry Skinner in EastEnders, so if I can, I will put them in here, but I don't know if I'll be able to, so if I can't, I will leave them linked in the description of this video if you want to go and watch them.
There you are. What, you were hiding from me?
And why would I do that? Still on for a big night out tonight, are we?
That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I completely forgot about this council meeting tonight.
You'd rather go to some stupid council meeting than take me out?
It's my job, Kerry. It's important. Look, I can't show my responsibilities. Anyway, you won't want to marry me if I was out of work. I'm going to have the best night out ever. You like Tenerife again?
Without the sun this time, I hope. It's coming in, boys. Tell me more about this big night out you got planned.
As any young aspiring actress would be, Gemma was absolutely over the moon when she landed the part in EastEnders, and this just proves that she was a talented actress, because obviously it's not easy to get a role in a very big popular soap such as EastEnders. I imagine that they had several people audition for the role, and so like I said, that just shows you that she was a really talented actress. However, Gemma's role in EastEnders came to an end in February of 2001 after she had spent around 5 months playing Kerry Skinner, and once she had left EastEnders, her career in acting just kind of fizzled out. Gemma realised after she left EastEnders that she didn't really want to be an actress anymore. It wasn't really for her. It wasn't what she thought it would be like. She would continue to go for auditions here and there, but she just kind of fell out of love with acting. I just think it wasn't for her anymore. And so Gemma just took the decision to stop acting for a little while, and she decided to go and get a normal job. And I believe at the time of this case happening, she was actually working 2 jobs, one of which was in a nightclub. And she was also living in a house in Powter Street in Shoreditch in East London with her mother Pauline and her older brother Tony. However, Pauline was actually diagnosed with a brain tumour in 2011, and so because of that, she pretty much had to live in hospital, and so it was just Gemma and Tony living in the flat at this point. And so whilst Pauline was in hospital awaiting surgery, she decided to leave Gemma in charge of the flat where she was living with Tony, like I just said. So Gemma was now the one in charge of this flat. She was kind of managing it, despite her being younger than her brother Tony. But I think the reason that Pauline left Gemma in charge was just because Gemma was a bit more reliable and responsible than her older brother Tony, and so she just felt more comfortable leaving Gemma in charge. Like I mentioned before, Tony was a drug addict, and so Pauline just felt more comfortable leaving Gemma in charge. But also, as well as that, Tony had quite a lot going on in his life anyway at the time of this case. There was talk of redundancy at the place that he worked. Him and his girlfriend were not doing so well. They were looking like they were probably going to be breaking up. So he had a lot going on. And as well as that, his drug habit was getting worse and worse. He was constantly smoking drugs, even first thing in the morning. Gemma's oldest brother, Danny, remembers seeing Tony often around like 6 a.m. in the morning, just sat on a bench outside smoking or taking weed. And that's first thing in the morning. When Danny's off to work, Tony is just sat on a bench outside taking drugs. And because of this, it caused a lot of arguments between Gemma and Tony. They would argue a lot, and a lot of the time it was about Tony's drug use. Tony would often smoke skunk in the house, which is a type of strong cannabis, and sometimes the effects of taking this drug is that the person taking it can experience psychosis. Now, when I say psychosis, how do I explain this? When I say psychosis, I don't mean in the sense of he was having like hallucinations or anything like that. I mean in the sense that the person is out of touch with reality. Someone who takes a lot of skunk or weed, like Tony, sometimes, I'm saying sometimes, can find it difficult to determine what is real and what is made up in their mind. I don't really know how to explain it because I don't know too much about it. This is just kind of what I came across in my research on this case. The people around Tony felt as though because of his drug use, he was experiencing a psychosis. He was very out of touch with reality, and Tony's behaviour would become very erratic and very aggressive when he was taking these drugs. And on 2 separate occasions, he actually had his little sister Gemma round the throat. Gemma would constantly ask her brother Tony to just not take the drugs or smoke the drugs whilst he was in the house because, well, firstly, it made him really aggressive. He had his little sister round the throat on 2 separate occasions, but also, as most people know who have been around cannabis, it stinks. It is a very strong smell to be around, and Gemma didn't want that in the house, understandably. But Tony wouldn't listen. He didn't care, and he would continue to smoke drugs in the house, which would be a mess most of the time because Tony used to actually go through the whole house looking for money that he could use to buy drugs. But as well as that, he would actually take Gemma's possessions, he would take his sister's possessions and sell them without her permission, obviously, to get money for drugs. And of course, this made Gemma really angry. She was so frustrated with Tony, especially since she had so much else going on in her life, like her mother's brain tumour. She was working 2 jobs. She just didn't have the time or energy to be dealing with Tony on top of everything else. But every time Gemma would confront him about it, he would just get aggressive and defensive. He didn't really care. In Tony's eyes, he felt as though Gemma was constantly trying to boss him around, and I don't think he liked the fact that she was doing that because Gemma was his younger sister. He hated the fact that she was telling him what to do. But as well as that, people believed that Tony was always quite jealous of his younger sister Gemma. She had always been quite successful and she had a lot going for her, whereas he didn't really. But then on March the 1st, 2012, life would change for the Mccluskie family forever when Gemma disappeared. That day started just as any other normal day for Gemma. She was in the flat and she woke up and she made herself some breakfast. Whereas the first thing Tony Mccluskie did when he woke up that morning was he rolled over and he smoked a joint in bed. Gemma had her day pretty much all planned out. Her friend's child was doing a performance at the new local hospital wing, and so Gemma agreed to go along and just show her support. Once she had done that, she was due to go to her friend Erica's house for a little while. Then she was going to go visit her mother in hospital, and then finally she was going to do a shift at the nightclub. So she had a busy day ahead of her. So Gemma began getting ready for the day at around 8 AM that morning. She was getting dressed and putting makeup on and stuff like that. Meanwhile, Tony was still in bed. He had nothing to do that day really, and so he decided to run himself a bath that morning. But once Tony had turned the tap on, he actually climbed back into bed and went back to sleep, leaving the bathtub that was now filling with water unattended. Eventually, Gemma heard the water running and she ran into the bathroom, and the bath was literally overflowing with water because obviously Tony had turned the tap on and just left it. And so Gemma was really frustrated and angry with Tony. He was constantly doing things like this and she was just fed up with it. Like I mentioned before, she already had so much going on. She had so much stress and she didn't need the added stress that Tony was causing on top of everything else. So Gemma went into his bedroom and she began shouting at him, which of course woke him up. And during an argument, Gemma told Tony that she had just had enough of him. She was fed up with him. She had had enough of his behaviour and that she wanted him to pack his bags and leave the flat. She didn't want him living there anymore. And just before Gemma left the flat, she told Tony not to be there when she got home. Anyway, the day carried on as normal for Gemma, and at around 10 AM she drove to the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel where she watched her friend's child's performance. And there is actually a photograph of Gemma filming the performance on her phone, so I'll put that in now. Gemma is the one in the mustard yellow top. After the performance at the hospital, Gemma then went to her friend Erica's house as planned. I think they were just having like a little catch up. And while she was there, her friends recall her having a phone call with her older brother Tony, and this phone call was very heated. I don't believe they could hear exactly what Tony was saying down the phone, but apparently they could hear him swearing at Gemma and just telling her that he wasn't gonna leave the house. Then at around 1 PM, Gemma left her friend's house and she told them that she was gonna pop back to the flat and I think get changed before she was gonna go and visit her mum in hospital, and then obviously later that day she was going to do a shift at the nightclub that she worked in. Tony also rang Gemma's friends, who said that they hadn't heard from her, and together they all went to Gemma's work, the nightclub, just to see if Gemma had turned up the previous night. But they said that she hadn't, and she also hadn't rang in to say that she wouldn't be coming in either, which was really odd for Gemma. So immediately everyone was pretty concerned for Gemma. I don't believe it was in her character to just go off and not tell anyone where she was going, and so everyone was really worried about her, including her older brother Tony, who actually broke down and was just like shouting, "Where is my sister? What's happened to my sister? When's my sister coming home?" He was really upset about this whole situation. So Gemma's family and friends were asking around pretty much everyone that Gemma knew, just seeing if they had heard from her. However, there was literally nothing, no sign or contact from her whatsoever. And so on the 3rd of March 2012, 2 days after Gemma had last been seen, her friends and family decided to report her missing to the police. So Gemma's older brothers Danny and Tony Mccluskie and her friend Nicole all went together to the police station to report her as a missing person. And Tony was asked by the police when he last saw Gemma. However, each time he was asked, he would give different answers, although he did admit to being the last person to see Gemma before she disappeared, because she obviously went to her friend's house and then she returned home before going to visit her mum in the hospital. Tony said that Gemma returned home after being at her friend's house. However, she was only there for a short while before she left to go and visit her mum in the hospital wing, and that was the last time he saw her. But like I mentioned before, every time he was asked about Gemma and the last time he had seen her, little things in his story would change. And everyone around Tony, including his older brother Danny, did think that this was a little bit weird, but to be honest, they just thought that he was stoned or on drugs, and so that's why he couldn't really remember exactly when he last saw Gemma. Like I said earlier on, Tony would constantly smoke like skunk and stuff like that, and so the people around him just thought he was stoned. They didn't really think much of it when he couldn't exactly recall when he had last seen Gemma. But this meant, because Tony kept kind of changing his story here and there, it was really difficult for police because they couldn't determine exactly when Gemma was last seen. And at this early stage in the investigation, police need to know exactly when she was last seen, exactly what time, you know, what she was wearing and stuff like that. So it made it even more difficult for police that Tony couldn't really remember that. Meanwhile, whilst the police were looking into Gemma's disappearance, her brothers Danny and Tony were developing pictures of her to give to the police, and also put on missing posters that they were putting up around the local areas, hoping that someone would see one and come forward with some information about where Gemma might be. People were really trying their hardest to find Gemma. Search parties were held for her. EastEnders stars were posting about her disappearance on social media. But unfortunately there was no luck, and for days there was literally nothing to go on. That was until the 6th of March 2012, 5 days after Gemma was last seen. Her brothers Danny and Tony Mccluskie were receiving multiple phone calls from an unknown number. So both Danny and Tony Mccluskie were picking up these phone calls, and on the other end of the line was a man who claimed to have kidnapped Gemma and was holding her captive. This man also said that he had been sexually assaulting Gemma and that he wanted £2 million ransom money from the brothers in order for Gemma to be returned alive and well. However, in another phone call from this unknown number, this man also said that he wanted 500 Iraqi dollars. Now this number was a withheld number, so it was blocked, meaning that police had to try and trace this number so that they could try to identify the man making these phone calls, because at this point this was looking like a potential lead in the case, and police were hopeful that Gemma was alive and that she was just being held captive somewhere. The person who had made these phone calls had gotten Gemma's brothers Danny and Tony's numbers from the missing posters that they had put up around the area, and these phone calls were heard by several of Gemma's friends and family members, because they were all together obviously searching for Gemma. And so everyone was hoping that these phone calls would help them find Gemma and that she would be brought home alive. However, within just a few hours of these phone calls, Gemma's family and friends received the news that body parts had been found in Regent's Canal in Hackney in London. These body parts in the canal had been found in a suitcase that had been knocked open after it had hit a barge in the water. So all of Gemma's family and friends, including her older brothers Danny and Tony, just gathered by Regent's Canal, and they were all just praying that these body parts were not Gemma. And at first they didn't think that this body was Gemma because the body parts were really small, and so they thought that maybe these body parts belonged to a child. However, these parts were small because what was found in the canal that day was just the torso of a person. So someone had dismembered this body and chucked part of their body in Regent's Canal. But without even testing the body for DNA, detectives were pretty certain that this body was that of Gemma Mccluskie, because obviously they found the torso, and on the back, on Gemma's lower back, she actually had a bow-shaped tattoo, and this bow-shaped tattoo was also found on this torso, and so they were pretty certain that this was Gemma. And this was confirmed when DNA was tested from this torso, and it was found that this body was that of 29-year-old Gemma Mccluskie. So the news was broke to Gemma's family and friends, and obviously everyone was absolutely devastated, and they couldn't make sense of it. They couldn't understand why someone would want to do this to Gemma. And Gemma's oldest brother Danny actually had the heartbreaking job of having to tell their mother Pauline, who was obviously in hospital, that Gemma had been murdered. And so now what was at first just a disappearance case was a murder inquiry, and the police had a killer on their hands, and so they had to re-question pretty much everyone that Gemma knew. So they re-questioned Tony Mccluskie, Gemma's older brother, because obviously he admitted to being the last person to see Gemma on the day that she disappeared. However, this time in Tony's second questioning, once again, his answers kept changing, and almost every answer that he gave contradicted everything that he said in his first questioning or interview with police. And so because of this, it was pretty obvious to police that Tony Mccluskie was lying. He definitely knew more than he was letting on. And even Tony's own brother and father had a feeling that Tony wasn't telling the whole truth, and Anthony, Gemma and Tony's father, actually said to Danny that he thought that Tony had something to do with Gemma's murder. And I just think that that alone says a lot about the kind of person that Tony Mccluskie was, because if even your own father and brother think that you could have had something to do with your sister's murder, that doesn't look good, obviously. Especially since at this point in the investigation, there wasn't really anything concrete linking Tony to the crime. It was just the answers that he was giving and the way he was acting that made him appear suspicious. And so once again, Tony was interviewed, he was re-questioned, and this time he was interviewed under caution, meaning that he had his right not to say anything, and that's exactly what he did. He was pretty much saying no comment to every single question that he was asked, which of course is his right. He has every right to say no comment to the questions that he's being asked. However, this is an investigation into the murder of his younger sister. So if he was innocent, like he was protesting, because he was denying any involvement in his sister's murder, if he was innocent, why wouldn't he want to answer the questions that the police are asking? Surely you would just do anything that you could to help police solve this case and find the real killer. I get that he wouldn't want to incriminate himself, but like I said before, this is an investigation into the murder of his younger sister. Surely you would just want to help police as much as you could. You wouldn't just say no comment. Why would you say no comment in these circumstances if you had nothing to hide? So at this point, police were pretty certain that Tony had something to do with Gemma's murder, and so 10 days after she was last seen, Tony Mccluskie was charged with her murder. Even though police didn't really have any concrete evidence to say that he was the one who killed her, they still had enough evidence to be able to arrest and charge him with the murder. But if Tony kept denying involvement in the crime and he eventually went to trial for this, the police needed to find more solid and concrete proof that he was the person who murdered Gemma in order for him to be found guilty. And so a forensic team were sent to the house that Tony shared with Gemma because that was the last place that she was seen. And we know for certain that Gemma did return home that day because her car was caught on CCTV at around 1:30 p.m. as she drove back up to her house. So they were sent in, and inside the house the forensic team found traces of blood and human tissue in the bathroom, and when this was tested it was found to belong to Gemma Mccluskie. And the detectives believe that the bathroom was where Tony Mccluskie dismembered Gemma's body. And they also found traces of blood and human tissue on a kitchen knife in the home. Meanwhile, whilst all of this was happening, other parts of Gemma's dismembered body were being recovered from the canal, including her right arm, which was discovered on the 19th of March, and then her left arm was discovered in the canal 3 days later. And then the day after Gemma's right arm was discovered, her legs were also recovered from the canal. But there was still a part of Gemma's body that hadn't been found yet and would not be found for quite some time: her head. So at this point, police were trying to piece together Tony Mccluskie's movements on the day/evening that Gemma disappeared. And I believe in his version of events, he said that he never left the flat that day apart from on one occasion when he went to a local Tesco. However, the police actually managed to get a hold of some CCTV footage from the day after Gemma's disappearance. This CCTV footage, which I will put on screen now, was, I believe, from outside of their apartment, and it shows a man carrying what looks like a very heavy suitcase, and he is putting it into the boot or the trunk of a taxi. And so the police somehow managed to track down this exact taxi that this man on the CCTV footage used, and in the boot or trunk of this taxi there was found to be blood, and this blood, when tested, was found to be a match to Gemma Mccluskie. And the detectives were certain that the man on this CCTV footage was Gemma's older brother Tony Mccluskie, and that inside the suitcase that he was putting in the car was some of Gemma's body parts. And the driver of this taxi told the police that the man who had gone in the taxi that night with the suitcase had asked to be driven to Regent's Canal, where obviously Gemma's body parts were found. So this CCTV footage of the man putting this suitcase into the taxi was shown to Gemma's father Anthony and also her other older brother Danny, and they also said that they were pretty certain that the person in this footage was Tony Mccluskie. So now there was a lot of evidence against Tony Mccluskie. However, he was still denying any involvement in his sister's murder, and so the case went to trial. But before Tony's trial had even begun, 6 months after Gemma's torso was found in Regent's Canal, her head was discovered on the 10th of September. It was found further along the canal by a member of the public who I believe was like cleaning the water or something. Whilst they were cleaning the canal, they came across a bag in the water and they had a look in it, and inside of it they discovered a severed human head. And so they obviously contacted authorities, and the head was identified through dental records as 29-year-old Gemma Mccluskie. And on the 30th of November 2012, Gemma's funeral was held in East London, and literally hundreds of people showed up to obviously pay their respects and say goodbye to Gemma. Sadly, Gemma's mother Pauline was just too ill to attend her daughter's funeral, and she actually died as a result of her brain tumour a year later. Tony Mccluskie's trial began at the Old Bailey Court in London on the 13th of January 2013, and suddenly Tony actually decided to change his version of events. So this whole time Tony was maintaining his innocence. He was saying that he had absolutely nothing to do with his sister's murder. However, now he actually decided to plead guilty, but not to murder. He decided to plead guilty to manslaughter. Tony's defense tried to claim that Gemma was the type of person who could lose her temper quite a lot, and that she would have fits of rage, and that's exactly what happened on the day that she died. They said that Gemma had been screaming uncontrollably at Tony, and the last thing Tony remembered because he was high on drugs that day. The last thing he said that he remembered was Gemma coming at him with a knife. And so it sounds like he was trying to claim that he was trying to defend himself by killing Gemma because she was coming at him with a knife. It was like he was trying to blame Gemma for her own murder. Everything was someone else's fault with Tony Mccluskie. Nothing was ever his fault. It was always someone else's. But Gemma's family just did not believe what Tony was saying at all. Gemma wasn't like that, and it was just so obvious that Tony was lying. The defense also tried to claim that because Tony was stoned and obviously on drugs that day, that he couldn't remember killing or dismembering his sister's body, which seems a little bit hard to believe. So during the trial, the prosecution obviously presented their version of events, which is the version of events that most people believe to be true. The prosecution believed that on the day of Gemma's death, Tony Mccluskie lost his patience with Gemma when she returned home on the 1st of March 2012 at around 1:30 p.m. They said that when Gemma returned home that day, she once again told Tony to leave the house because she was fed up of his behaviour and his drug use within the home. But Tony refused to leave the house. He wasn't going to be kicked out by his little sister, and they actually began shouting and arguing with each other, which is actually backed up by a neighbour who could hear them both shouting and Gemma crying. This neighbour told police that on that day she could hear the two arguing and Gemma sobbing, and she did consider going over to their apartment to see if Gemma was okay, but she decided not to in the end. I think she probably just didn't want to intrude or anything. However, this arguing continued, and the prosecution believed that at some point Tony Mccluskie picked up a heavy blunt object and hit Gemma over the head with it. Now, it's believed that Tony hit Gemma over the head with this blunt object at least twice because her skull actually had 3 fractures. So he possibly could have hit her 3 times, but it would have been at least twice. Hey guys, sorry to just kind of interject here, but I just thought of something whilst I was editing back this video. I just thought of an interesting point that I thought I would add in here. So like I just said in the last clip, Gemma had 3 fractures to her skull, which suggested that she had been hit with a heavy blunt object at least twice. And whilst I was editing this video, I realised that that fact alone completely discredits Tony's version of events that said that Gemma went to attack him first with the knife and that he was just acting in self-defense. Because the fact that he hit her over the head with this blunt object 2 or 3 times, to me, doesn't suggest self-defense. It suggests that this was a murder, obviously. So yeah, that just kind of completely discredits his version of events. Sorry to just kind of add this in here, but I didn't remember to mention it whilst I was filming the video, so I do apologise about that, but I did still think it was an interesting point to include. And I couldn't actually find anywhere what police believed this heavy blunt object was, so I don't think they even know, and I don't believe this weapon was ever found. And they theorised that as a result of these head injuries, Gemma most likely would have died from a bleed to the brain. Now, what happens next is obviously not confirmed, but the prosecution believes that Tony, once he had killed Gemma and she was obviously on the floor, they believe that he picked her up and put her in the bathtub, and that he tried to dismember her with a kitchen knife. However, he realised that this kitchen knife wasn't going to work, it wasn't going to dismember a body, and so he went out to the shop and brought a meat cleaver, some bin liners and some cleaning chemicals. Using the meat cleaver, Tony dismembered Gemma's body into 5 separate pieces, and then he obviously tried to clean up the crime scene with the cleaning chemicals. And the following day, he just acted as though nothing had happened. He was just acting normal, and he actually tried to cover his tracks by sending some text messages. He firstly sent a text to his kind of on-off girlfriend, and he said, "Morning, sorry, crashed out last night, woke up too late to get back to you, feeling a bit better today." And he then tried to give himself an alibi, and he sent a text message to Gemma's phone that said, "Hi Gem, letting you know I'm at the hospital. Mum is doing really good and the doctors are pleased with her. Going to look at the the throat and swallowing today. Love ya, with 2 kisses on the end. But when police took a further search on Tony's phone and they were kind of looking through his older messages with Gemma, they found that that was the only time he had ever texted his sister saying that he loved her. So he was trying to come across as this really caring older brother who loved his little sister, when in reality he never told her that he loved her. And then later that night, Tony obviously booked a taxi and he put some of Gemma's body parts in this suitcase and dumped it in Regent's Canal, obviously hoping that they would never be found. However, he actually couldn't take all of Gemma's body parts in this taxi in one trip, and so he actually walked with the rest of the body parts the few hundred yards to the canal. And then the next day, we obviously know what happened. He tries to act like this concerned brother who is worried about his sister that never returned home. So Tony's trial lasted for around 2 weeks, and on the 30th of January 2013, 36-year-old Tony Mccluskie was found guilty for the murder of his younger sister Gemma Mccluskie, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. Tony apparently showed absolutely no emotion when his verdict was read out, almost like he didn't care. He wasn't remorseful at all for what he had done. And the judge accused Tony of trying to divert the investigation into Gemma's case by texting her the day after he killed her. So after the trial and after Tony had obviously been sent to prison, Tony and Gemma's father, Anthony Mccluskie, actually made the decision to still visit his son Tony in prison and stand by him despite what he had done, which of course is his decision. I think for Anthony, he had already lost one child, he had already lost Gemma, and he didn't want to lose another. However, 4 years after Tony's conviction, Anthony Mccluskie officially announced that he had disowned his son Tony because he had continued to visit Tony in prison. However, Anthony said that Tony just didn't show any remorse at all for what he had done to Gemma, and so Anthony just didn't want anything to do with him anymore. It's one thing taking the life of someone else, but to not even be apologetic or remorseful for it is just insane to me. And Anthony said that Tony wasn't like that at all. He wasn't apologetic, he wasn't remorseful, and so he decided to disown him. Also, quickly before I end this case, you may be wondering who made those phone calls to Danny and Tony Mccluskie in the days after Gemma's disappearance, saying that he had abducted and sexually assaulted Gemma and that he wanted a £2 million ransom in order for her to be returned home safe and well. Now, when I first started my research into this case, I thought that this person who had made these phone calls was someone that Tony had asked to do it, or maybe paid to make these phone calls as a way of kind of covering his tracks and giving himself an alibi. But Tony Mccluskie actually had nothing to do with the person who made these phone calls. So like I said earlier on in the video, the number that these calls were coming from was actually withheld. So it was a blocked number, although of course police have a way of tracing these numbers anyway. And this number was traced to a 19-year-old man named Sam Dunn. So Sam saw the phone numbers for Danny and Tony Mccluskie on missing posters that they had put up around London, and he obviously for some reason decided to call them and joke around that he had abducted Gemma, which is obviously a sick and twisted joke. Sam was charged with 4 counts of sending by a means of a public electronic communications network a message that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene or menacing character under the Communications Act. And he actually denied these counts. However, he later changed his plea to guilty, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for each count, so 2 years in total. And that is pretty much it for this case. That is the case of Gemma Mccluskie. Let me know what you guys think of this case in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on it. I just think it's a really crazy case. Cases like this honestly blow my mind, to think that a sibling can take the life of another sibling. I can't comprehend that. Quickly before I end this video, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, the link is in the description of this video. Please do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. And yeah, that is everything that I have to say, I think. So I will see you again very soon for another mystery with Mollie. Bye, guys.